Looks pretty majestic, doesn't it? Do you ever wonder where it came from? Who came up with the bright idea that shooting a rocket launcher at your feet would allow you to jump really, really high in a video game? Well, rocket jumping is an example of what we call emergent gameplay. Essentially, multiple small game mechanics interact with each other in a way that makes a more complicated mechanic emerge. In rocket jumping's case, it's pretty easy to explain. Rockets deal damage and have high knockback, but they don't kill you in one hit. Shooting rockets at enemies makes them experience knockback, but shooting rockets at yourself at the peak of your jump will also make you experience that knockback, giving you a vertical boost. There's countless examples of emergent gameplay in countless other games. There's more on that in the video in the sidebar. But for rocket jumping in particular, where did it first show up? Because rocket jumping is featured in more than just one game nowadays, but when did it all begin? Well, the experts in the audience are probably all screaming, it's from Quake at their monitors, but it actually first showed up in 1993 in the game Doom. You'd be forgiven for thinking that it was originally from Quake though, because the rocket jump in Doom is quite unimpressive and it doesn't really help you very much. It was extremely difficult to get any height with your rockets. It mostly just sent you horizontally. But this rocket jump could be used to get to a secret exit in one of the levels, although there were more intended methods to reach that secret exit instead. Rocket jumping was also featured in a game called Marathon, made by Bungie, but the rocket jump in that game was very similar to the one in Doom, very niche and mostly for horizontal movement, and it didn't really show up very often. But the much more exciting implementation came from Quake, released in 1996. This is where rocket jumping went from a niche mechanic only really used for one secret exit to becoming an extremely versatile tool to speedrunners and a core game mechanic in the multiplayer game. Quake spawned a lot of weird emergent gameplay stuff that we just sort of take for granted today. Stuff like bunny hopping, circle jumping, strafing, and of course rocket jumping were all originally found as quirks of Quake's game engine. And people liked these quirks so much that they added them into their own modern games as well. Rocket jumping came to define Quake in every way imaginable. The multiplayer in all of the Quake games was extremely fast-paced, even without rocket jumping. Add in the ability to fly across the sky like a majestic eagle, and that pace gets even faster. Turns out, people really like skill-based movement. It adds a ton of depth to a game that press shift to rocket jump can't possibly match up to. Now, Quake had quite a lot of mods back in the day. People would make all sorts of crazy stuff to spice up their Quake games, but there's one mod that is far more well known than any of the others, and for good reason. Team Fortress is that Quake mod. It was an extremely popular mod that allowed you to choose to play as any one of 9 classes, each class having different starting weapons, different health and armor, and different special abilities that they could all use. Rocket jumping, unsurprisingly, was extremely useful in this Quake mod too, arguably even more than in the base game, because the soldier class started out with a rocket launcher at the beginning of the round, and he had a fairly high armor count and health count, which meant that he could rocket jump quite a lot if he wanted to. Because of this, rocket jumping was just as much of a staple in the mod as it was in the base game. It only took 2 years after that Quake mod released for the developers of the mod to get hired. Valve hired the developers of the mod to work on a standalone Team Fortress game. Valve had only recently just released Half-Life, and they wanted to make a multiplayer shooter next, so they thought that a Team Fortress game made on the Gold Source engine would be a great first multiplayer title to release. In 1999, Valve released Team Fortress Classic, which was effectively just a port of the Quake mod into Gold Source. It had some new particle effects and new models, but it was basically the same game. Team Fortress Classic, just like all that came before it, featured rocket jumping. Although rocket jumping in this game was not the main source of mobility. Rocket jumping got very heavily outshined by conch jumping. The medic and the scout started out with concussion grenades, which they could use to fling themselves around in a very similar way to rocket jumping. Concussion grenades didn't deal any self-damage, and they knocked you back much further than rockets did. Combine this with the fact that Medic and Scout had faster walk speeds than the Soldier, and that made the Medic and the Scout the most mobile classes instead of the Soldier. The Quake mod of Team Fortress also had conch jumping, but it wasn't quite as crazy as it was in Team Fortress Classic. Valve started development on Team Fortress 2 pretty much immediately after releasing Team Fortress Classic in 1999. But since TF2 released in 2007, you can probably tell that there was some hiccups along the way in development. Originally, TF2 was going to have a realistic war aesthetic, and much more realistic game mechanics to go alongside it. So it's quite likely that rocket jumping wouldn't have even been a feature in Team Fortress 2 in this state. Luckily for us jump mains though, the plans they had for this game didn't quite work out, so they went back to the drawing board. In fact, they went back to the drawing board about 3 or 4 times. They eventually settled on a cartoonish 1960s aesthetic, where each class is very bold and very distinct from each other class. And guess what core mechanic is still in the game? You guessed it, the spy can still disguise as enemy players. Also, you can rocket jump. TF2 removed grenades from the franchise entirely, so the Scout and Medic no longer had concussion grenades, which meant that they no longer had mobility that outmatched the soldiers. So rocket jumping went back to being the core movement mechanic in the game. The Demo Man also gained some new movement tech in Team Fortress 2 with sticky jumping. You could technically do this in Team Fortress Classic, but it was very ineffective. The Demo Man in TF2 is actually more mobile than the Soldier is, but the Demo Man has less starting health and sticky jumping takes more damage with each jump than rocket jumping does. The movement mechanics in Team Fortress 2 are the most refined they've ever been, and if you ask me, nothing has come close to as clean and precise as the movement in TF2 ever since. But the base game was very limiting. People realised that there was a ton of crazy stuff that you could theoretically do with rocket jumping and sticky jumping that just wouldn't be possible in a normal game. You were far too limited with the amount of health and ammo that you had to do any of these ridiculous techniques. But good old Valve has always been very, very good at allowing their communities to mod their games. They allow people to make custom maps, custom server plugins, and custom game modes as much as they possibly want to. So people got to work. Jump maps started off pretty terrible at first. People didn't really know what they were doing, so there's plenty of old maps that have terrible ammo regen, stupid pixel perfect hole jumps, and everything is spaced out terribly. It's quite difficult to find exact release dates of maps, so how old maps are will be roughly an approximation. 3 maps that were extremely revolutionary for their time was RJ Rocketeer, Jump Hobo, and Jump Rush. These weren't the first jump maps, but they were the first half-decent ones. These maps are 13 years old. People still play Jump Rush to this day somewhat frequently, even though it's 13 whole years old. Hobo and Rocketeer don't really hold up as well though. Then comes maps like Jump Adventure and Jump Pagoda. These are classics to this day, even if they don't really age that well compared to modern maps. Then comes the big boys, Jump Beef and Jump Cuba. These maps are old, but they're gold. Jump Beef is a perfect beginner map that is potentially the most popular jump map ever made, even to this day. Jump Cuba is one of my favourite maps. There's a couple of weird jumps in there, but for the most part, every single jump is perfectly made. This is where the more complicated stuff starts getting utilised a lot more. Sinks didn't show up particularly often in very old maps, but these are the oldest maps that they frequently showed up in. Or at least the oldest maps that are still popular today that they showed up in. Another map called Jump Little Man released at a similar time as well. At the time, this was considered the hardest jump map ever made. And it is pretty hard, even now, although there's a lot harder maps than this nowadays. Little Man has a bunch of awesome jumps, and a bunch of really, really terrible ones, but it's still regarded as a classic. Cuba, Little Man, and Beef are all about 11 years old. The dates that maps released on gets extremely murky from here on out, but maps got slowly and slowly more complex and more refined over time. More visually appealing, more unique from one another, everything improved. We went from jumping up and down over random sloped blocks to flying through the map as fast as the game engine will possibly allow you to move. People even make gimmick maps now. Stuff like this, where your rocket turns around 180 degrees whenever you right click, and you can use it to airshot yourself and you can fly. Rocket jumping went from a niche game mechanic in a rudimentary first-person shooter to its very own game mode with a community thousands strong. The next step for jumping is for it to go from a mechanic in a first-person shooter to a game mode in its very own standalone game. Momentum Mod will have rocket jumping and sticky jumping as core game modes, not as some weird community-driven game mode in a nearly 14-year-old game. When Momentum Mod officially releases, jumping will take its next big step, but it's already come a really long way. There are of course many other games that we didn't talk about that feature rocket jumping, but none of those games even come close to the complexity and replayability of jumping that Team Fortress and Quake have provided over the years. Thanks for watching.